You are now listening to Let's Be Honest with Just Johnda. Hello and welcome to Let's Be Honest with Just Johnda. And this is one of our special edition LBDs, our legal breakdown. And tonight we are going to be discussing the Derek Chauvin case. And I have got a special guest, a great friend. Her name is Eva Zelson, and she is going to be joining me as we talk about the George Floyd murder, which of course resulted in the case we're dealing with now. And I almost made the mistake that I hate to do when people call it the George Floyd case, because it really is the Derek Chauvin murder case, or Derek Chauvin. I've heard his name so many times, so many different ways. And so we are going to be talking about that tonight with you for about an hour and just going over what we thought of the case, this presentation, and how it's been put on. And I believe I have Eva on now. Eva, you there?
Yes. Hi, Johnda. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and as I was telling everyone, you are a civil rights attorney. If you could tell me a little, or tell the audience, I know, of course, a little bit about where you practice and what type of law you practice. I know civil rights, but that covers a wide swath. So why don't you just tell us a little bit?
Absolutely. So I am practicing in the beautiful Philadelphia area. I know everyone's really jealous. I get to live in New Jersey. I
Yes, I'm a
practice.
Jersey girl, so hey, I don't live there now, but Jersey girl for life.
Exactly. I love it. I love it. So I practice primarily civil rights and employment discrimination law. I work on behalf of people who've suffered discrimination at the workplace. I also file lawsuits on behalf of people who've suffered police brutality or other violations of constitutional rights. My firm is legal redress chair for the NAACP in New Jersey, so I'm very happy to say that I get to do a lot of cases involving primarily racial discrimination, which is one of my favorite and very, very important types of cases to litigate.
Sad that there's so many of them that still need to be litigated, but at least we have somebody out like you out there on the front lines.
I say every day, I'm so sad that I still have a job. Every day, I
Yeah,
mean, I love my job, but I can say I wish it didn't have to exist.
exactly. And it looks like we may have a little. Okay, came back. I got a little message that said we were having a feedback problem, but it's
Oh,
fine. So, well, yeah, this thing is really sensitive. So it's like we got to be almost like robots in terms of our movements, picks up everything. But so let's get into it. So we know that the Derek Chauvin case stemmed from the murder of George Floyd back in May of 2020. The the death of George Floyd, which was unfortunately caught on video, fortunate for from the standpoint of justice, but unfortunate from the standpoint that we now live in a time and place where, due to technology, if something horrific like this happens, many of us end up witnessing someone die. And
right.
many people all over the world have felt pretty strongly that not only did they witness someone die, but they witnessed someone being brutally murdered.
Exactly. And I think that that's exactly why this trial in particular has been so interesting to watch. It's the human element that we're seeing,
Yes.
especially with all the prosecution witnesses. And I mean, I'm sure you've sat through now hundreds, if not thousands, of trials, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that you'll say in your experience, that this human element, we can try to capture it, but it's not always easy. And it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, having people speak about witnessing a brutal murder is certainly, it makes for an interesting
Yes.
trial. But going back to your point, it's horrific that we all saw this and that we're all reliving it over and over.
And even from the witness standpoint, it's great that you brought that up. As you and I both know, witness testimony, even eyewitness testimony, depending on what side of it you're on, and I don't know if there's anything near you that's moving around, I'm still hearing it, but depending on what side of it you fall on, of course, like if it favors you or doesn't, then there is always the argument available, and not an inaccurate one, that as crazy as it may sound, eyewitness testimony a lot of the time, not a little bit of time, but a lot of the time is terribly unreliable.
Right.
Depending on where the person was, the time of day, the conditions, where one person is standing that gives an account. And if there's several witnesses, unless they're all standing on top of each other, looking out of the same set of eyeballs, they're going to see things from different vantage points. One may have seen a stick, the other person didn't. Well, was there a stick, or is it because of where the other person was standing? So you have those things. And then, of course, the human element, but in a different way when we're just talking about your typical case, because part of the human element also means that you are bringing in a wealth of that person's life and experiences and the way that they experience and see the world. And we all do that. The way that we see and experience the world a lot of times can be affected by the sum total of our life's experiences or our prejudices, the types of stereotypes, or on the flip side, if we have a certain affinity for one type of person over another, men versus women. All of those things are the backdrop of what we bring into what we see and hear every day. So even what you see can be very much like a game of telephone, which is interesting because, as a kid, the game of telephone is always based on what we heard.
Right.
But interestingly enough, as attorneys, you and I know that you could actually play that same game with what people see. Well, what makes this one different, circling back to this trial, is we have people who are giving voice to what we all saw. And we can also pick out if anybody has an inclination to try to, color what they saw in a different way.
Exactly.
And for some of us, the emotions and the feelings that they are expressing are very much what we felt as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I totally agree. And I mean, you probably, and I also completely agree about you were saying about eyewitness testimony. And people may recall Genevieve Hansen, the firefighter who testified for the prosecution. After she witnessed the murder, she described George Floyd as a slim, short man because from her vantage point, she only saw him under the knee of somebody. So that's what he looked like.
She only saw him on the ground.
Exactly.
She didn't see this alleged hulking figure that the defense tried to paint him as.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of to go back to your point about eyewitness testimony, but also humanizing things, because we've all seen the video. We've all read about Mr. Floyd and his life, and we've kind of been able to contextualize this. But seeing it from the eyes of the witnesses on that day without having the benefit of now almost a year of hindsight, a year of context, a year of fighting, a year of
Yes.
advocating, seeing it through their eyes, I think, has been especially powerful in that regard. Especially, I think it was one of the first witnesses who testified, that little girl.
Oh,
I know, walking with her cousin.
yes, the 18-year-old who was 17 at the time, and
Right.
then her little cousin. Oh my God.
I know, my heart was breaking. And I remember thinking to myself, well, she shouldn't have to be seeing these kinds of things. That's horrible. But obviously, there's little kids all over the country who are living this every single day. And most of them we don't see because they're not called to testify in a major trial. But that really, I think, has humanized not only the murder of George Floyd, but has helped to humanize kind of this ongoing discussion that we've been having, or some of us have been having for 400 years about police
Exactly.
brutality, and how people of color are made to live these realities every day.
And this little girl, you just encapsulated it. This little girl, and her cousin as well. I mean, because this was traumatic for everyone. And I think that the gentleman in particular, and that's not to minimize the trauma on the women, but as we know, just as a society, a lot of our litmus test of how bad something really is when you see the impact on a big strong guy.
Right.
But this young lady and her cousin, well, I'm not even gonna call her a young lady, this little girl and
Right.
her cousin, who was a girl, 17 years old, went to the store for as simple a thing as anybody goes to the store for snacks. For as simple as snacks. There is no argument that anybody's parents wasn't supervising them, or they shouldn't have been there anyway, or any of the trash that you hear when it comes to people, particularly those who may be towards the lower end of the economic stratosphere, or just minorities in general, that somehow we are responsible for our trauma, or
Right.
if there is a little kid involved, there was some level of irresponsibility on the part of somebody, anybody, parent, whomever. This is daylight. This is in the middle of the afternoon, going to the store to get snacks. And apparently such a normal type of occurrence that the cousin, the 17-year-old, felt comfortable actually sending the younger one into the store herself to
Right.
pick out her snacks and wait for her outside. And while she was outside, of course, her attention was grabbed by this unfolding murder.
Right.
And she, being so wrapped up in it, which anybody would have, the younger one came out and unfortunately saw what she saw. And that's no one's fault in terms of those kids, because they were both kids and clearly traumatized to the point of even not moving and staying there. She took out her phone. Well, yeah, because she didn't know what else to do. And that generation takes out their phone for everything anyway.
Oh, yeah. And look, I'm glad they did, because if we didn't have a video of this, it would have been something in the back page of maybe some people's papers in Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
And
in Minneapolis.
The story would be told by the officers, and we'd hear a much different story. And then I think, and I'll say, testifying like this brave little girl has done is a double-edged sword, especially when you're a young child. But I will say that there is something to many of my clients very cathartic and very kind of soul-soothing about being able to stand up in court and say, this happened, it happened to me, or I saw it and it was wrong. And I'm sure that her parents have thought a lot about whether this will have an impact on her and all sorts of things like that. But having the option to do that, and we only give people the option to do that when there's a trial. And the only reason there's a trial here is because of that video. I think
Absolutely.
people being able to do that, and you mentioned the grown man who broke down in tears, the MMA fighter, Genevieve Hansen, all these people getting to tell this story in a forum that
Yes.
specifically exists to redress wrongs, I think has been very helpful, probably for them to process this incident, but also for our country to process this incident.
I agree 100%, because we all can feel through them, especially since we saw it, although not in person as we did. We all can feel through them exactly what you said, that in some way, this particular issue, is it going to cure everything all at once? Of course not. But in some way, this particular issue makes, in this situation, going on trial, gives us, excuse me, some sense of an attempt at justice and real justice.
Right.
And because of that, I'm going to bring us to move us forward into the actual trial itself. Now, you and I have talked a couple of times about this, just in terms of the way that we felt the trial was being presented, and the fact that it was presented in a way that was so textbook that you even said there, you could see this being a trial that is being used in a law school classroom. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did say that. And what we talked about is how they went through and told a very coherent story here. They started at the beginning and they ended at the end. And some people out there may be laughing, how else would you do it? But you would be surprised.
They'd be amazed at some of the things that we have seen.
Right, exactly. I'm sure I've seen trials that started in the middle and never told the beginning or the end.
Exactly. And the reality of it is that, even in fairness to attorneys who may have tried this case in a different way, there were other ways that they could have done this, and it still have been effective. It just kind of depends on what they thought would, sort of what you feel like you need to make a powerful start and make your big finish. Because on this trial, he could have, and I don't think anybody would have necessarily thrown any tomatoes at him. He could have very well started with a lot of the medical, because of the fact that he knew that the defense's case hinges entirely on the medical, because there is literally nothing you can do with the facts in terms of 3 officers and then ultimately 1 who stayed on him. But there is nothing you can do with the fact that is what happened. That is the visual. And God bless the prosecution, as hard as it was for everyone to show that recording as many times as possible to drive home that fact, that whatever he may or may not have been doing beforehand, not that it was anything outrageous, because they couldn't even come up with anything like that, but whatever he may or may not have been doing beforehand, drugs, hanging out in the store, maybe not passing a counterfeit $20 bill, which we have found out was not counterfeit. Resisting for the sake of resisting, or maybe, the drugs, whatever it is. However you want to do the dance with all of that stuff, what it comes down to is something that you just can't get away from, which is Derek Chauvin's knee on this man's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And because of that, the only thing that they had to really work with to try to get around that is cause of death. So the prosecution could have very much started, if they chose, with dealing with those medicals and then finishing more so with the human element to try to maybe take the wind out of the fact that we're going to do all this, the humanizing part and people crying and all of that. And then the defense get up and start talking about medicals again. That may not have sat well with the jury if the last thing they heard before the defense attorney got up was, or the last thing they saw was people crying, crying, and a middle-aged man being so overcome that the judge literally had to stop court for the day.
Right. I think
so.
Right.
So they definitely could have done that in a different way, but I agree with you. I like the way they did this. Absolutely textbook. I mean, and I'm talking textbook right from the opening when I was waiting for him to just use the word roadmap, because that's the word we learn in law school, giving you the roadmap. Did he give us a roadmap or what? He really did.
He did. He gave us quite a roadmap. And what all lawyers out there will tell you is the jury will remember especially the first and the last thing that you show them. So I really liked how they started with some of I think, the most powerful of the prosecution witnesses to humanize this. And I mean, if you're a member of the jury and you don't know much about this case, which of course that I'm sure
they do, but
right, exactly. They've done their best to get an unbiased jury who doesn't know much about this case, but everyone knows something about it. You're going to be primed to say, okay, why are all these people so upset? And of course, in the back of your mind, if this man had overdosed, if this man had just had a heart attack, it would be upsetting for everybody watching, but there would not be this depth of sadness and of hurt and of anger. And then to follow that up directly with the medical results saying, well, that feeling that you're feeling, there's a reason for that. It's because, it turns out that when you watch somebody die right in front of you because he's having the life squeezed out of him, it's not for some random other reason. It's not because the man didn't eat kale and run 3 miles every day. It's because there was somebody with his knee on his neck right then.
Yeah. And I mean, and folks can dance around again, how or why. Well, that doesn't mean it was racist, or it doesn't matter. Right. Now, as a person of color, again, as I said, everybody walks into every situation with their life experiences, things they're learning, their imprint there. So as a person of color, I see a white officer with his knee on this black man's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, then I am automatically, whether it's not even intentional, it's not even anything conscious, my mind is going to go to a certain place as to why that is happening. And I get that, because that is what we deal with doing what you and I do in every situation, because we've got to peel back the layers of that part of what our clients are telling us. So I get that part, but it is feeling that this is why it's happening and seeing it happen. We know that lynches have occurred. Some people have even had the misfortune, I know, like people in my grandmother's generation, and I'm blessed to have my grandmother still living, have had the misfortune of even seeing the after effects, of course, because obviously if they saw it while it was happening, they'd probably be hanging right next to the person. We saw and heard the after story of what happened to someone like Emmett Till, and his mother, of course, in her wisdom saying, no, the whole world is going to see this. But as effective as that was, as effective as it is for someone like a Billie Holiday in her haunting voice to sing Strange Fruit, or to read the accounts of Ida B. Wells in talking about lynching, as amazingly effective as those pictures and stories, and even hearing the accounts of people like my grandmother and others who literally saw the person hanging from the tree, it is still a whole other level when you are watching it happen second by excruciating second.
Right, exactly. And I'm so glad you brought up race, because one thing I tell my clients, and I practice civil law where our standard of proof is lower than in criminal law, but when we're talking in general about these issues, racism does not have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, obviously, the criminal charges themselves do, but I think that there's so much pressure on people of color. If you ever were to say, oh, this was motivated by race, you get cross-examined. Well, how do you know? Did he say? What makes you say? I mean, I've heard ridiculous things like, oh, well, when he said we don't like renting to you people, maybe he just meant people who worked at that bank. Things like that, making people of
Of
color doubt
course.
their own lived experiences. So what I tell my clients, people who've called me about potential discrimination, is, look, you've been on this earth for however long you've been on it, and that whole time you've been living in the same skin. You are smart enough to know the difference between someone having prejudice or someone being racist and someone who's a jerk. Because that is the lived experiences of many people of color. And I think that people are very good at knowing when that is happening versus, plenty of jerks out there, of course. We know that too.
And you and I know there's the discomfort that comes along with it, where people don't feel comfortable acknowledging things like racial discrimination for what it is, because somehow it makes them feel like they are being accused of something. This
Right.
is and it's not just in this situation, it's in a lot of situations where people feel uncomfortable having these conversations because, or acknowledging that it may be because somehow that says something about you, that the department acknowledging that race may have played a role in this, or the state not willing to add civil rights violations to it, make it seem as if they are it makes people feel as if you're saying something about yourself.
Right.
We
Right.
recognize that institutional racism is there, and the acknowledgement of the fact that it's there does not necessarily mean that you are indicted as in some way of being not so much a part of it, but sort of a purveyor of it. You and I both work in the justice system, myself in the criminal justice system, a criminal justice system that we know has been one of the largest, or I won't say the largest per se, I will say one of the most obvious places where institutionalized racism is made very real for regular people every day.
Right.
Me acknowledging that and working in it does not in some way mean that and I don't embrace the notion that I'm a sellout or something like that, or even my friends who are prosecutors. That does not change in any way how I feel about prosecutors, male or female. I mean, I'm sorry, African American or white or any other race. And the same thing with officers.
Right.
The institution itself supersedes all of us.
Exactly.
What people like you and myself are trying to do in the midst of the broader notion of attempting to change those things, in the meantime, in working with what we have, we are trying to navigate it using the knowledge that we have to make sure that our clients are not subject to the downside of being and living in a system that is, inherently racist.
Exactly. And the system, predates us. I won't say exactly how old I am, but I will say it's less than
I think
250.
we can all safely say it predates all of us,
Right.
considering
So,
how old it is.
right. So, I mean, I'm not hundreds of years old. So it's interesting what you were saying when you talk about institutional racism or even just inherent bias that some people have and aren't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
aware of. People get offended, like, well, I didn't do slavery, or my favorite, well, my ancestors suffered as well, which is completely and utterly besides the point. None of us were around 250, 300 years ago. And that's never been the accusation. I mean, that would be a ridiculous point of discussion. And it sort of shows how oddly we as in Americans kind of view this whole conversation when the first thing you want to say is, well, I'm less than hundreds of years old to make a very obvious and sort of
Oh my
bizarre
gosh, how many times have you heard that?
I know. And things like, um, things like, well, my ancestors also suffered, like, okay, I'm not, detracting from that. But the best way I've found to deal with that is to say, I think that is a very important conversation to have. I'm so
It
sorry your
is.
ancestors suffered, but I'd like to finish this conversation first. Can we do that? Because we're allowed to talk about other groups suffering in the United States. I mean, Irish people when they first
Absolutely.
came, it's we're not saying that can never be talked about, but it's always brought up in the context of whenever we're trying to talk about the horrible injustices that have been inflicted upon African Americans. Then it's always, let's
Absolutely.
change the subject.
And
Nobody ever.
let's face it, we know that if there is any other group besides people of color, and particularly African Americans, who have gotten the shaft, it would be anybody who is at the lower end of the economic stratosphere. If you
Right.
want to say that if we want to acknowledge that there is a segment of society that hates Black people, there is an equally large segment of society that hates poor people even more. So we know that there are other groups that have suffered, and chances are certainly back, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, absent other circumstances, people who came over as immigrants were individuals who, and I'm sorry, I'm distracted. I've had to block some people, but who came, who came over as immigrants were going to be largely poor and
Right.
taken advantage of in their own way. But when you have a group that has been systematically treated as less than, then you are going to have that group at the intersection of two things that are going to make it difficult to navigate a world where institutional racism is a part of how we live. And that is when they are caught at the intersectionality of being a person of color and poor and of course uneducated as a result of probably both of those. And it's like a monster that feeds itself, because that institutional racism also is geared towards keeping people in their place, and their place is at the bottom of that of society. And who's at the bottom, or how do you keep people at the bottom? Well, they're poor, because if you can't, let's say with what we do with being attorneys, if you don't have access to certain things, certain knowledge, finding attorneys, paying attorneys, if you are not in certain sectors of society where you find out certain information that can help you, then you can't ever help your situation, and it doesn't change. And like I said, it's a monster that feeds itself. And then when you end up in the unfortunate position of being on the receiving end of some type of brutality or discrimination from someone who is in a position of authority, which is what we're dealing with here in the Floyd case and several others. Now we've got the Daunte Wright case.
Right.
When you are on the receiving end of those things, it makes it even harder to for those around you to seek justice.
Exactly.
Because those around you don't know what to do, and they're trying to do it all within the context of being at the low end of the totem pole.
Exactly. And I like what you said about how it all feeds into each other, because that's absolutely right. And what I've seen a lot of when people are always trying to avoid talking about race, that has been, besides mass shootings, one of the most American things lately that's been going on. And what I've noticed is a lot of people like to say, well, it's really not about race, it's about poverty. And that's really what's holding people back. And the question that I always ask is, okay, why is it that there's a higher rate of poverty among people of color then versus white people? Because there is. And we know it's because of hundreds and hundreds of years of institutional racism, of ensuring that white people or people who can pass as white are the ones who have the tools, so that if they work hard and maybe get a little bit lucky, maybe they'll be able to start building some wealth. So, it's all these factors. There's not, one single thing we can point to and isolate and say this, this is the one that we should be talking about, especially if you're trying to take race out of the equation, because we spent so many years making sure that race was not only part of the equation, but the only equation.
And even with this case, you made a good point, because of course the defense in this case wanted to take all kinds of stuff out of the equation, which it got to a point where it was almost comical. Even in this particular case, even if you were to take race out of the equation, okay, no race in the equation. I'll give you that, just so you know,
right,
just for shits and giggles. And you've got white on white, black on black, whatever, however you want to call it, for this person having their knee on the neck of this other person for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. How does that change the fact that we watched, the world unfortunately now has watched, or at least heard in some way, that we watched a man literally have his life snuffed out, like I said before, second by excruciating second.
Right.
From taking breaths to not taking breaths, to all of us learning way more than we needed to about involuntary bodily movements and functions when you die, when your heart stops, how that happens, what the definition of asphyxia is, and all of that. How does any of that change what we saw? If race is, if we were to grant people a favor and take that out of it, how does that change? How does it change when, if we were to even say that it was necessary for these three officers to do what they did in order to subdue him, once he was subdued, what's the other 4 or 5 minutes for?
Right. Exactly. I mean, I think that anybody who is not having hatred in their heart has seen this, understands that this was not a justified killing. And sort of when people are talking about, well, is it race related? Is it not? That's getting to broader issues in our society. And I think it's really interesting that we keep coming back to, okay, but this 9 minutes and 30 seconds, or I'll be fair to the officer, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Obviously, this isn't right. And so many people are quick to defend his actions, for all the normal reasons, George Floyd, like most of us, was not a complete and utter angel for the entirety
Okay,
of his
excuse me
life.
for a moment. Ninja, for those of you who may be listening later, this is live. I'm going to have to block you. I do not have any issue with the fact that people disagree with me. In fact, I rather enjoy it and makes it interesting for me. But what I will not do is allow someone to bogart my page using profanity and saying the same things over and over. It's not about canceling you. It's about you not wasting everybody's time.
Right. And for anyone listening out there, it's about capitalism. Capitalism lets us choose who we want to have on our own platform. So if
and who we want to engage with. Exactly.
Right, exactly. So I appreciate that, Johnda. I think that sometimes, disagreement can be used as a sword. People say, oh, you don't want to hear from me. No, I want to hear from anybody who disagrees with me if they can do so politely.
Heck, doing what we do, and as much as you and I talk, I mean, we need people to disagree with us just to give us something else to talk about, and then we'll just talk for another hour. I mean, we don't have an issue with that.
Right.
We live and breathe disagreements.
Exactly. Disagreements are why you and I have jobs. We love disagreements.
Exactly.
But I mean, those disagreements are not
disagreements and disrespect are two different things.
Right. I mean, and I usually look to whether someone's writing in all caps with tons of emojis or not. Usually, if it's all caps, tons of emojis, lots of misspellings, and random capitalizations, it's not going to be a very productive disagreement. Just a generalization.
Okay, we've given him enough attention, but back to you. So, but anyway, so let's talk a little bit about, because we're going to be wrapping up in about 19 minutes. So we're going to talk a little bit about the evidence, because now at this point, both sides have presented. And as you all have heard us both talk about, we actually liked the way that this case was presented. And I will be honest and say, I appreciated the way that the case was presented on both sides. Look, to use a phrase that a judge said to me once in my younger days, and I was a PD, and I think it was maybe about my first or second time appearing in front of him in juvenile court. And of course, as a PD, I had a bunch of cases for the day. And he called me up to the bench. And again, I was fairly new. So I was like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? And that's really bad, because you don't even know what you did wrong. And that's even worse. And so he said, and he gave me a compliment, and he goes, I like the fact that I know you're young and you're probably nervous, but if nothing else, you definitely seem to have mastered the art of trying to turn a sow's ear into a silk purse. And although my family's from the South, I wasn't raised in the South, and this was in Virginia. So it was a bit of a new phrase for me, but one that I will never forget. And of course, I immediately understood what he meant. And that is absolutely what this guy had. I mean, you've got your client on video with his knee on somebody's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. You have people around them who were at least asking to assist. You have someone who even said that they were emergency personnel. You had individuals who, while you may not have liked what they said at all times or how they said it, none of them actually tried to run up on him or anything like that. That's a lot to defend. And on top of it, the world is watching, and not just the world is watching the trial. I mean, the world was watching during the OJ trial, but the world did not see the actual murder be carried out. This was that trial was no different than watching any other trial, except it had a high profile person involved, a sports figure, America's obsession with sports. It had a high profile person involved, and the family had made them, by the time the trial came along, the family had sort of become in an odd way, minor celebrities appearing everywhere, and you had the whole car chase and all that. So yeah, you had all the extras that come along with the fact that compared to some of the previous quote unquote trials of the century, you had the fact that these things could be televised, whereas they were not in the past. And I think that also made it very interesting as well, because even with the Rodney King case, and you correct me if I'm wrong, and I was in college at the time, so if it was televised, I would have been in class, but I do not believe the actual trial was televised. We just, heard the verdict when they came, and maybe the verdict itself was televised, but I don't believe that every aspect of the trial was televised. If it was on court TV. It wasn't on like network television the way that OJ was on like ABC, NBC, and CBS.
Right.
So I mean, I remember I was in law school when that trial went on, and and instead of watching all my children, because yes, we did watch that in law school too, we were watching the OJ trial. So they so yeah, this trial was very different in that it's not just the fact that we saw it on TV, but we all in some way, like you and I talked about earlier, because of what we saw, we many of us, I can't speak for everyone, but many of us, and I know myself and you, because we've talked about it, felt an emotional investment in this. We were all witnesses in some way. No matter when you saw the video, you were still a witness. And so this whole thing was very different. And coming back to the defense, had to make crafting a defense for this incredibly difficult. I can't think of anything of this nature, of any type of case like this, that's more difficult to craft than when I have dealt with the cases regarding child molestation and even having individuals admit to things. I mean, I had a case once where the grandfather said about the 8-year-old who he had been molesting since she was like 6. Well, she seduced me. What the hell am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah, nothing.
That's a statement that you made to the police, and now you decide to plead not guilty? Thanks.
Right, exactly. And that's a good point. I mean, I think that Chauvin's defense attorney, Eric Nelson, has done a good job with what he has, which is just trying to make sure that, his goal is to see if one person on the jury misunderstands reasonable doubt.
He only needs one.
Exactly. And maybe is confused. I know a lot of people get confused about reasonable doubt, and people start saying, well, what if aliens beam down and they're the ones that killed him? That's not
reasonable doubt.
Right.
Is one, it is a standard that it is as simple as it may seem. When you have people in that jury, and God bless them, I think a lot of people who don't deliberately go out of their way to get out of jury duty or feel like that they're under duress because somehow they managed to get picked even though they were praying not to. I do believe that absent, somebody like trying to be, racist or anything like that, a lot of these people's goal when they go into it is they want to do a good job, if for no other reason than they want to prove I'm not stupid. I'm capable of understanding it. And on top of that, once you have sat through a trial, especially a lengthy one, you become invested as well.
Right.
Because as part of that jury, you are very much a part of the process. You are just as important at that phase, if not more important than the judge, because the trier of fact in a jury trial is you. It's not the judge. It's you. Now, in certain states where, like in Virginia is one of them, where we have bifurcated hearings. So you have your trial that deals, for those who are not Eva and I, you have your trials that is just guilt or innocence, and then a separate hearing, which can still be done on the same day. I mean, just after the guilt or innocence phase, and then maybe we'll take a break, especially if time allows, because you sort of switch gears for what you were going to use to argue for punishment. And then you have a separate phase to deal with the punishment piece. And then the judge may become a bigger figure in that, because in some states, if the jury finds you guilty, it's the jury who sentences you. And that's the way Virginia deals with that. However, there's an additional thing that we do here in Virginia is you come back 6 to 8 weeks later and the judge sentences you. The judge may sustain whatever the jury put in place and give you the same sentence, or you may do better with the judge. Some states, if the jury finds you guilty and they sentence you, that's it. Some states, if the jury finds you guilty, it's still the judge who sentences you. The jury never has a shot at it at all. So the sentencing piece may circle back to giving the judge, that final say so, especially if you're found guilty. But in a situation like this with a jury trial, the power absolutely belongs to the jury. Now, at that point, the judge is truly a presider in terms of making sure that things are done right, and objection, no objection, etc. And in that way, it's still very much like somebody presiding over a meeting, because ultimately, if you're presiding over a meeting and you're the chairman, if someone says something wrong or whatever, you're supposed to catch it and rule on it.
Right. And it's interesting that's an interesting point you make, because we've had a jury system now for hundreds of years. It's not a new system, but it does seem like all of us have a much more personal stake in this because we watched it over and over and over.
Yes.
And because from many angles, and when the trial started, and we can all watch it now, we can watch all of the testimony, all of the witnesses. So having the system now where it's people, it's us, people drawn from the community deciding it, does seem very appropriate, where oftentimes I think jurors are not necessarily the best system for certain cases.
Oh, not at all.
Right.
Not at all, especially depending on where you are. I actually had this conversation in one of my LBDs. I think it was maybe episode 4 when the trial was first starting, and the jury situation can talk about it potentially being a nightmare for certain defendants, depending on where you live, how the jury pool is even determined, because as we know, sadly, there is no uniformity, like so many things in the justice system, which also is problematic. There is no uniformity from state to state. I'm not even sure if it's uniform from county to county, but definitely not state to state in terms of where their jury pool even comes from. Some pull it from voter registration rolls. Well, not everybody votes or thinks that voting is important. The DMV, and then we know that, okay, so you're talking about people who just happen to be registered at DMV in any way, or licensed drivers. Do people whose driver's license have been suspended, do they count? It can be real funky. And then, of course, depending on where you live, or not even where you live, where your alleged infraction was committed, the jury may look nothing like you. I've had young men from DC where if they got picked up for doing the things that they were accused of doing, the jury might look a whole lot more like them, but they got picked up in West Tubahickey, Virginia. And the jury looks nothing like them. And despite the fact that they were there because the people in your town obviously love the same drugs that their folks up in DC like, there are people who are going to be on that jury who feels like the problems that they're having in this town is because of outsiders like you that are bringing them in here. And excuse me. Oh, and on top of it, you're a 20-year-old young Black man.
Right. Exactly. And if you want a real live funny version of this, you can watch the movie My Cousin Vinny, which, like most
there you go,
movies, isn't really like how we practice, but I think can put a good spin on it. Those are two boys who find themselves on trial in the deep, deep South, having not been to the deep, deep South before, and being looked on with skepticism and as outsiders. And that's something that a lot of criminal defendants have to deal with. And I think race is the
and
most
criminal defense attorneys.
Right, exactly. And race is, I think, the most readily apparent thing, but
It absolutely
there's all
is.
sorts of things that can come into it. I mean, and from my perspective, in the civil perspective, I can tell somebody, well, your case would be worth twice as much in a different county, in a different district, where the jury is more inclined to believe people who claim discrimination, or is more inclined to give significant money damages. So, I think that when we think of the justice system, we think of it as kind of a very serious balancing the scales, justice for all, equal justice, but it's really
there's so many elements.
Right. Very dependent on where you are, who's around you, and what those
money
people are thinking. So I think that, and of course we could talk about that particular topic for at least, 40 hours.
Yeah, we're going to have a whole other conversation about that, because there is the power of money that comes into play in all of this as well. And it's not in the way that people think that it's the power of money that comes into play in terms of you buying your way out of something. No, it's just the level of representation and you can have the most amazing lawyer in the world in terms of their level of intelligence, etc. But if they don't have the resources, because you don't have the type of money it would take for them to avail themselves of the additional resources, because that's the other thing that people, I think we're beginning to understand it a lot more, because there's so much more information available, a lot of very bad and false information available, but there is a lot more information available if you know who to listen to, who not to, and where to look. But the fact is that we have a system where when you have people who are charged with something or who have a claim, there is a lot that needs to go into it, especially when in instances you've dealt with on the civil side, when you've dealt with police brutality cases, or I've dealt with on the criminal side, you are going against the full resources of the state. And depending on the state's interest in the situation, or now because of the times we're living in, when everything, no matter how big or small your town, which we definitely see an example of with the case, oh my gosh, what is this gentleman's name? I wrote it down, but the Army lieutenant,
in Virginia, right?
Yes, Lieutenant Nazario. Yes, Lieutenant Lazario, Windsor, Virginia, little itty bitty like speck on the map of Virginia. But because of the times we are living in terms of information being available, we find out about this case when he filed suit, because some people may not realize that situation actually happened in December, which is another example of the fact that there are these things going on all the time and you don't know anything about it. But and of course him, being alone, he didn't have someone else, and the whole thing. But at any rate, if there is an interest by the state, or like, let's say the local even if it's the local municipality, in making sure that they don't lose because of what you and I talked about earlier with not wanting their department to appear to be racist, or if this officer is found guilty, then that's a reflection on all of us. Because of that, that to me speaks to the whole idea that it speaks to the whole idea that you then have these people who can get the full resources of the state, potentially even federal resources. As we see, they can get the FBI and whatever. And all of that is pointed like two barrels against you. And
right,
what do you
exactly.
do? I mean, even, as it relates to Derek Chauvin, I think we both are very clear about how we feel about what he did, since we both call it a murder. Even with that case, from the standpoint of the defense, because, I'm always going to think about those things because I've spent my life as a defense attorney. If it wasn't for that GoFundMe and whatever else that the people did to help him come up with the money, whether we like it or not, his defense wouldn't have been able to do what they did. Experts cost money.
Exactly.
And we're talking about him going expert per expert up against the state.
Right. Exactly. And look, when there's a David Goliath situation, it can be so intimidating. And that's why it's so important we have people like you, Johnda, who are doing what you do. And I'm happy in this one instance that Chauvin has no one's going to say that he didn't have enough resources here to mount a defense.
No.
He had there's been a lot of outpour of support, things like that, because I am hoping that there's a conviction, of course, and I'm hoping that conviction is not at all no one can really challenge it with a straight face. I
think that the prosecution has done more than what they needed to do, just like, because I know we have to wrap it up, just like the situation on Friday with the judge ruling against them in that motion. I don't even think it was necessary. I think that, quite frankly, it was and I think you and I talked about this, it was very risky for the prosecution to even go ahead and put the witness up anyway, despite the fact that the judge admonished him about the extremely narrow tightrope that witness was going to have to stay on, because, again, experts are there to explain things. They have no other purpose. So if you were putting an expert up to say something and they can't explain it, that's risky, because their inclination is to launch into the explanation that they can't give, because the judge has now admonished you that if they don't give it, if they start going down that road, you're going to get a mistrial. And in that particular case, yes, could the prosecution have put someone on earlier to address the whole carbon monoxide thing and because it all ties back to the tailpipe? Sure. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, even if the defense did argue something about him having potential carbon monoxide poisoning, which they didn't even have data for anyway, but okay, fine, they said that. Come back in your closing and just say, oh, and by the way, that whole carbon monoxide thing, not that is even amounts to a hill of beans, but just to lay it to rest. Even if George Floyd was in front of the actual tailpipe for the entire 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and somehow we found that it was carbon monoxide that killed him, and the blood saturation and all of that, how did he end up in front of the tailpipe blowing into his face for 9 minutes and 29 seconds? All of it still circles back to the same thing. If asphyxia is described as the lack of oxygen, which leads to your heart stopping, and that was the cause of death. Okay, how did he get asphyxiated? Well,
Right.
when
Exactly.
someone's knee was cutting off his, so it all still circles back to the same thing. So that didn't bother me. We'll give the defense attorney a win for making a good objection. In fact, it was a great objection. And quite frankly, it was an objection that was helpful to the prosecution, because had they not made that objection, or if they did make it and the judge overruled it, then that absolutely would have been a great appealable issue. Or, cause for them to make a motion for for a mistrial, judge doesn't grant it, and then they appeal the judge's ruling on the mistrial. But either way, it could have been a disaster if it was allowed to happen, whether the defense objected to it at the time or not, because as we know, in the criminal setting versus the civil setting, you tend to get a little more leverage as a defendant, because it's your liberty that's physically at stake. You tend to get a little bit more leverage in what you wage on appeal, especially if it is a good issue. And of course, you combined your allegations or your grounds for appeal with ineffective assistance of counsel, because he did not raise that objection. So you'd be covered either way. Whereas in the civil setting, at the very least, you've got to at least note the objection, whether you're overruled or not, or chances are you're not going to be able to get it in on appeal. Excuse me. So predictions, because I know we have to go. We're 6 minutes over. Prediction from my end, I do think that, at least from what we've seen so far, that there is more than enough evidence that has been provided. And if the jury, someone doesn't get hung up on that whole reasonable doubt piece, which everyone, I'll talk about more when we have another episode this week regarding the closing and jury instructions. It really doesn't make a lot of sense to do that now, but I just, based on the evidence, no jury instructions, none of that, I think there's more than enough evidence for, at the very least, the third-degree manslaughter, because that's such a big catch-all. But I do think that there is enough evidence for a depraved indifference second-degree.
Right. I agree with you.
Manslaughter. I don't know about the second-degree murder. I think too much is required. But either manslaughter is you've got depraved indifference just from the fact that the way that they did it from the start was problematic in terms of all three of them on him, but him staying on him, there's just no excuse for it.
Right. I completely agree. And my prediction would be the same as yours. I have said over and over, I shouldn't be predicting these things, but I've never once listened to myself, and I'm not about to start. So,
and and it's funny. I don't usually either. If I had a bunch of clients that were listening to this, they'd be like, "She's never done that for me." Yeah, because I don't. Even for my own clients, even when I walk in the courtroom with my chick bad, ringing in my head, knowing that we're going to hit it out of the park, I still do not say, "You're going to hit this out of the park. I'll see you out, and we'll be good. Meet you for drinks in the parking lot," which I would never do with a client anyway. But you know what I mean,
right?
But since it's not my case, I can sit around and wax poetic like everybody else. So. But so I thank you so much, because I know you have to go, and actually I need to. I've got to do another episode in a little bit, but I so appreciate you, everyone. This again is the marvelous Eva Zelson, and I am going to definitely put her information in the episode notes. But Eva, once again, why don't you tell everybody where you are and what your firm name is and how they contact you?
Sure. Thank you, Johnda, and thank you so much for having me. As always, I've had an excellent time. I always love talking with you. Again, I am at Zeff Law Firm, ZEFF, in Philadelphia. I'm happy to talk to you, though, no matter where you are in the country, because justice has no borders. So if you want to reach out to me for any reason, you can ask Johnda for my contact information, or you can email me Zelson at glzefflaw.com, Zelson at glzefflaw.com. That's ZEFF law. And Johnda, again, thank you so much. It's been fantastic to be here, and I hope I get to talk with you again soon.
Oh, absolutely. We've got lots of ground to cover.
Can't wait. Can't wait.
Okay, you have a great one.
You too.
Now, everybody, I am actually going to be ending there as well, because as you know, if you've been following the case, I'm going to disconnect Eva. As you know, if you've been following the case, we are moving into closing arguments tomorrow. I suppose it depends on how long that takes. I'm sure both sides have been honing their closing arguments over the weekend, and I'm sure before that, but definitely over the weekend. So it will, I estimate, based on the fact that each of them took about I think the prosecution's opening was about 2.5 hours. I had it at the time. I don't have it in front of me. The defense's was not quite as long, but it was over an hour. I think it was maybe about an hour and 45 minutes. I expect that, given certainly the prosecution in particular, that given the sheer number of witnesses that they put on, the smart money would be on them not going chapter and verse for each witness and wearing the jury out, because they've still got to sit through jury instructions. So you don't want to do that. But they do still need to, for one of a better way of putting it, they may feel like they need to put a period at the end of a few sentences, especially after the defense the defense is gone. The defense did not have quite as many witnesses, and their defense theory was pretty clear. I mean, ultimately, the defense, whether it's because of the pathology, whether it was because of his heart, whether it was because of the allegations of drug use or the drugs that were actually in his system, however you slice it, the defense's theory on this case, or at least the theory they would like the jury to buy into, is that George Floyd died from causes other than what Derek Chauvin did. Now, that's a difficult case to put on, because ultimately, even if he did have other conditions in play, if you did something to knock the domino over that sent the rest of them falling, then you're still responsible. On the civil side, we call it the eggshell skull theory. It doesn't matter if you bop everybody else on the head and they're fine, but you bop this one kid on the head and they die because they just happen to have a condition that made their skull so sensitive that any type of pressure to it would kill them. Well, you take your victim as you find them. If you weren't bopping people on the head in the first place and ultimately bop this person on the head, then they wouldn't have died. So whether or not they had this extra disease, they were walking around with it, fine. And for all we know, could have walked around with it for the next 15 years, but you had to go and bop them on the head and activate a chain reaction that ultimately led to their death. Well, same thing here with George Floyd, even though this is a criminal case. Drugs notwithstanding, heart issue notwithstanding, there does not appear to be any evidence that any of those issues was causing him any problems. We saw him moving around in the store and, bouncing around and doing whatever, and he may have been high, but whatever. With the young lady, I think it was like Johnda Wilson or something like that. He walked out of the store, his own 2 feet, got into the car with his friends, and seemed to have been fine doing whatever they were doing while before the police came along. And it wasn't until his interaction with you, and even more so, the part of the interaction that we all come to know as the 9 minutes and 29 seconds with the knee on his neck, that he ends up dead, including a substantial portion of that 9 minutes and 29 seconds where subduing him was no longer an issue because he was cuffed and, well, subdued. So, not an easy case to put on. And I think that is one of those things where even in their closing, the defense needs to just make it clear. I don't think that it is a closing that needs to go on for hours. I don't think that is a situation where they need to try to reiterate every single thing that that their witnesses said, or try to rebut every single thing that the prosecution put on, because that's what you do when you're presenting your case. They got to go second, and they had their own laundry list of experts as well. In fact, as we know, Derek Chauvin didn't testify, so experts was really the bulk of their case anyway. I think that this is one of those situations, at least for the defense on closing, they just need to focus on their best argument for the to try to sway at least one juror that there was some other reasonable explanation for why this man ended up dead, other than what the prosecution, of course, would like them to believe, which is just Chauvin's knee on the neck. And of the multiple things about whether it's the heart or the drugs or which expert, the smart money is honing in on what supports that theory best and just doing their best to drive that home. The weight of all the other evidence, right down to the video, supports the prosecution. There's not a whole lot that you can really do to get around that. And there's no point in attempting to fight that point by point, because if you do, you're just not going to win. They've got the weight of the evidence on their side with the video alone. What you or at least factually from the standpoint of the trier of fact, which is the jury. So their focus just needs to be on deciding what facts or what experts information supports the theory best that George Floyd's death is explainable in some other way, and just hone in on that. And that doesn't need to take all day. It doesn't need to take 2-3 hours, other than just making sure that they provide a good explanation for it, and maybe some exhibits, or not exhibits, but, a PowerPoint or two. But I just really think this is a situation, at least for the defense, where less is more. And other than that, you have our theories. Thank you so much for those of you who stuck around. And once again, I thank our guest. And as I said, her information will also be in the episode notes. I do have an email now, which I promised you all I would have. And remember to follow me on all social media platforms, including Twitter and Instagram, where my handle is Let's Be Honest. JJ. That's LETSBEHONEST, JJ for Just Johnda. And of course, we have much lighter things and fun over on my main page on Facebook, which is the Fashion and Drama Diaries, where we talk about all kinds of stuff, not just these more serious things. I reserve these for you with our LBDs, our legal breakdowns here on the podcast. And make sure you follow us on all podcast platforms and subscribe. Please subscribe, and on Apple, leave us 5 stars. You can DM me or email me if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to hear me talk about here on LBD, or even on Let's Be Honest. There's a lot of things out there, even whether it's entertainment, news, pop culture, all of those things I like to talk about. But there's so many things going on, especially in your neck of the woods versus mine, that I may not be aware of it. So make sure I do know. And if you are an expert at any of my topics, or have something juicy, especially as it relates to some of our celeb gossip, I want to see it. I'm going to vet it. But if you've got facts, it's all about the facts. You're not sending me facts or then don't bother. If you want to send me nonsense, don't bother, because, have thick skin, but I'm going to ignore it. Other than that, always remember, if you're thinking about it and want to talk about it, chances are I'm thinking about it and want to talk about it with you. So let's be honest together. Bye-bye.